A rancher named Jack Morrison stood at the fence line of Camp Swift, hat in hand, asking a German woman prisoner if she'd marry him. She wore prison-issue clothing. He wore dusty work boots and carried wildflowers picked from his own land. Between them stretched barbed wire, an ocean of propaganda, and a war that had killed millions. By summer, 37 similar proposals would cross that same wire, and Washington would send federal agents racing south to understand how American cowboys had managed to do what no Allied propaganda campaign could: turn enemies into family. The trains arrived in darkness. February 1945, and the boxcars rattled through the Texas night carrying cargo the locals had never expected to see. German women, prisoners of war, some barely 20 years old. Others middle-aged nurses and functionaries pulled from captured territories across Europe. The cars slowed at Camp Swift, 50 miles northeast of Austin, where the air smelled of cedar and limestone and the kind of heat that never quite left even in winter. Inside the cars, the women pressed against wooden slats watching America pass in fragments. Endless sky, flat land stretching to horizons that seemed to have no end. Ranch houses with lights in the windows, cattle moving like shadows across moonlit pastures. This was the enemy homeland they'd been warned about, land of savages and cruelty, where prisoners starved and guards showed no mercy. The doors opened with the screech of metal on metal. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan stood on the platform, clipboard in hand, watching as the women climbed down. Most moved slowly, stiff from days of travel, eyes adjusting to the searchlights that turned the camp perimeter bright as noon. They wore whatever they'd been captured in: Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, nurses' dresses, civilian clothes stained and torn from months of war. Some carried small bags, others had nothing but the clothes they wore. "Form a line," Brennan called out, her voice cutting through the night. "Single file, keep together." The women obeyed, silent and mechanical, forming a ragged column that stretched along the platform. Brennan walked the line, counting, checking faces against her manifest. 42 women, ages ranging from 19 to 53. All captured in France during the final Allied push, most from medical units that had stayed too long trying to evacuate German wounded before the American tanks arrived. A young woman near the front swayed on her feet. Brennan caught her arm. "When did you last eat?" The woman stared, uncomprehending. Brennan tried again in German, her accent rough but functional. "Wann hast du zuletzt gegessen?" "Gestern, maybe. I don't remember." Brennan turned to the guards. "Get these women to the mess hall before processing. They're dead on their feet." This was not procedure. Procedure demanded immediate registration, fingerprinting, assignment of prisoner numbers and barracks. But Brennan had served in North Africa, had seen what prolonged transport did to human beings, and she wasn't about to watch women collapse from hunger just to follow a checklist. The mess hall at Camp Swift had been built to feed American soldiers heading overseas for training. Now, at 2 in the morning, it stood empty except for 2 cooks who'd been roused from their bunks and told to prepare food for an unexpected arrival. They worked in silence, cracking eggs, frying bacon, making coffee strong enough to strip paint. The German women filed in, still silent, still moving like sleepwalkers. They sat at long wooden tables, hands folded in their laps, waiting for whatever came next. The propaganda had been clear about American prison camps: starvation rations, beatings, hard labor until you dropped. They expected tin cups of water, maybe stale bread if they were lucky. Instead, the cooks brought platters: eggs scrambled and steaming, bacon in strips that crackled with grease, toast, butter, jam, coffee in ceramic mugs, cream and sugar on the side, oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins. Orange juice, the first citrus most of them had seen in years. No one moved. The food sat on the tables, untouched, while the women stared at it like it might be a trick. In Germany, the British bombers had turned cities into rubble. Food came from ration cards, often just potatoes and black bread, sometimes nothing at all when supply lines collapsed. And here, in an enemy prison camp, sat enough food to feed a German family for a week. A woman named Greta Hoffman, 34 years old, former nurse from Hamburg, reached out slowly and touched the bacon with one finger. It was real, still hot. She looked at Brennan, who stood by the door watching, and asked in broken English, "This, for us?" "It's for prisoners," Brennan said. "That's you. Eat." Still, they hesitated. It was the smell that finally broke them. Bacon and coffee, aromas so rich and foreign after years of wartime deprivation that several women started crying without realizing it. Then Greta picked up her fork and the rest followed. And for the next 20 minutes, the only sound in that mess hall was silverware on plates and the occasional sob from someone who couldn't quite believe what they were tasting. Later, Greta would write in her diary, "The Americans gave us eggs, real eggs, not powdered, with bacon that tasted like before the war. I thought it must be a mistake, that tomorrow they would realize and take it back. But tomorrow came, and they fed us again." Camp Swift sprawled across 78 square miles of central Texas rangeland. Before the war, it had been cattle country, open prairie where longhorns grazed and cowboys worked spreads that stretched for days on horseback. Then the Army arrived in 1942, built barracks and training grounds, and turned it into a staging area for divisions heading to Europe. Now, with the war in Europe winding down, parts of the camp had new purpose. The women's POW compound occupied the eastern section, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by chain-link fence and guard towers. Not barbed wire, that was reserved for the men's compounds further south, where German and Italian soldiers lived in more restrictive conditions. The women's section looked almost residential, with open areas between buildings, picnic tables under shade trees, even a small garden plot that someone had started before the prisoners arrived. The morning after their arrival, Greta and the other women stood in formation while Lieutenant Brennan explained the rules. "You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention," Brennan said, pacing in front of them. "You will be treated according to international law. You will not be harmed. You will not be starved. You will receive medical care, male privileges, and work assignments appropriate to your status." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the formation. "You will also work. The convention allows it, and this camp needs labor. Some of you will work in the kitchens, others in laundry, maintenance, administration. Those with medical training will work in the camp hospital, treating both American personnel and fellow prisoners." A hand went up. Maria Vogel, 22, former Wehrmacht telephonist. "What about the fields?" "What about them?" "We were told American prisoners work like slaves in the fields. That we would too." Brennan's expression didn't change. "You're in Texas, not a cotton plantation. The work here is cooking, cleaning, paperwork. If you're assigned to the hospital, you'll be nursing. Nobody's picking cotton." She dismissed the formation and watched them disperse, moving toward their barracks in small clusters. They walked carefully, like people still expecting the ground to give way beneath them. Brennan had seen it before. Prisoners who couldn't quite accept that the reality didn't match what they'd been told, who kept waiting for the trap to spring. The trap never came. Instead, over the following weeks, the women learned the rhythm of Camp Swift. Morning formation at 7. Breakfast in the mess hall. Always more food than seemed reasonable. Sometimes steak, sometimes pancakes, always coffee. Work details from 8 to noon, then again from 2 to 5, with Sunday off entirely. Evening meals, lights out at 10. The work itself proved easier than anyone expected. Greta, with her nursing background, joined the hospital staff. She worked alongside American medics and doctors, treating everything from training injuries to the occasional illness that swept through the barracks. The Americans showed her respect, asked her opinion on treatments, even sought her advice on patients with unusual symptoms. Maria worked in administration, filing reports and processing paperwork, under the supervision of a clerk named Dorothy, who brought her coffee every morning and asked about her family back in Germany, with what seemed like genuine concern. Others worked in the kitchens, the laundry, the motor pool, keeping records on vehicle maintenance, and on Sundays, they had visitors. The first rancher appeared on a Sunday in late March. His name was Thomas Crawford, 58 years old, owner of the Circle C Ranch about 15 miles west of camp. He arrived in a dust-covered truck, hat in hand, and asked the guard at the gate if he could speak to whoever was in charge of prisoner labor assignments. They sent him to Lieutenant Brennan's office. Crawford took his hat off when he entered, holding it against his chest like a shield. "Ma'am, I understand you've got German prisoners here now. Women prisoners." "That's correct. I was wondering if any of them might be available for ranch work. I've got 3 hands left. Everyone else joined up or went to the city for factory jobs. Spring roundup's coming and I can't manage 70,000 acres with 3 men. Brennan leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Crawford, these are prisoners of war, not ranch hands for hire. I understand that, ma'am. But I also understand the convention allows prisoners to work, and I'm prepared to pay fair wages directly to the camp for their labor." Not looking for slaves, looking for help, and willing to treat them right. She studied him for a long moment. Crawford had the look of someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors. Weathered face, calloused hands, the kind of quiet dignity that came from working land that could kill you if you made mistakes. What kind of work? Mending fences, checking water tanks, helping with cattle when we move them. General ranch work. Nothing dangerous, nothing that violates any rules. I've read the convention guidelines. You've read the Geneva Convention? Yes, ma'am. Borrowed a copy from the library in town. Wanted to know what I was getting into. Brennan made a note on her pad. I'll need to verify this with Washington, but if it's approved, I'll send you prisoners who volunteer. Nobody goes who doesn't want to. 3 days later, approval came through. The War Department had decided that agricultural work fell within acceptable labor categories for female POWs, particularly in areas where the local economy suffered from labor shortages. Camp Swift could assign prisoners to local ranches on a temporary basis, provided the work met certain safety standards, and the ranchers paid fair wages to the camp administration. Brennan called for volunteers. 12 women stepped forward, Greta among them. They'd been in the camp for 6 weeks now, and while conditions were far better than anyone had expected, the monotony was starting to wear. The chance to work outside, to see something beyond chain-link fence and barracks, held appeal beyond just breaking routine. The following Sunday, Crawford returned with 2 other ranchers, Jack Morrison from the WWII and a younger man named William Hart, who ran a smaller spread called the Broken Arrow. They arrived in trucks, and Brennan watched from her office window as the prisoners climbed into the truck beds, sitting on hay bales the ranchers had placed there for comfort. The convoy rolled out through the gate. Brennan stood watching until the dust settled, then returned to her paperwork, wondering if she'd just made a mistake or solved a problem. The land opened up like a revelation. Greta sat in the back of Crawford's truck, watching Texas unfold around her in all directions. In Germany, the landscape was measured in villages and forests, fields marked by ancient boundaries and roads that curved around hills. Here, everything ran straight to the horizon, as if the land itself had been stretched flat by some enormous hand. Barbed wire fences marched across prairie grass that moved like water in the wind. Cattle grazed in clusters, red and brown shapes against the endless green. The sky above held more space than seemed possible, blue and vast and empty except for hawks riding thermals. They reached the Circle C just before noon. Crawford pulled up to the main house, a low structure of limestone and cedar with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. His wife Margaret came out wiping her hands on an apron, smiling like they'd brought unexpected but welcome guests. "You'll want lunch before we head out," Crawford said, climbing from the truck. "Margaret's got sandwiches ready." The women hesitated. Greta spoke for them. "We are prisoners. We should work." "You'll work better on a full stomach," Margaret said. "Come on inside, there's lemonade too." Inside, the house was cool and dim, all the curtains drawn against the midday heat. Margaret had set out a spread on the dining table, sandwiches, pickles, potato salad, a pitcher of lemonade beading with condensation. The German women stood awkwardly until Margaret started handing out plates. Then they sat and ate in silence, still not quite believing this was real. After lunch, Crawford took them out to the south pasture in his truck, explaining the work as they drove. "We've got about 5 miles of fence line that needs checking. Posts come loose in the spring rains. Wire gets stretched by cattle pushing against it. You'll walk the line in pairs, mark any damage with these flags." He held up strips of red cloth. "And I'll come back later with tools to fix it." He stopped the truck near a metal gate, let them all climb out, then pointed across the pasture. "Fence line runs from here to that windmill you can see in the distance. Take your time. Stay in pairs. There's water jugs in the truck bed if you need them. And if you see a snake, don't try to be a hero. Just back away and mark the spot. We'll handle it later." Then he drove off, leaving them standing in grass that reached their knees, with nothing but fencing wire and open sky in each other. Maria turned to Greta. "He just left us." "He did. We could walk away." Greta looked around at the endless prairie. "Walk where? The nearest town is probably 10 miles. We don't know which direction, and even if we found it, we're German prisoners in Texas during a war. Where would we go?" Maria nodded slowly, then picked up a bundle of flags and started walking toward the fence line. "Might as well do the work then." They spent 4 hours checking fence that afternoon. The work was simple but thorough. Walk the line, check each post for stability, look for breaks or stretches in the wire, tie a flag where repairs were needed. The Texas sun beat down with relentless heat, and the wind carried dust that got into everything: hair, eyes, mouth. But something else happened too. As they worked, moving slowly across the prairie, the landscape began to work on them. The sheer openness of it, the sense of space that had no boundaries you could see, created a feeling that was hard to name. In Germany, even before the war, everything had been close and defined. Cities pressed together, countryside divided into farms that had been worked by the same families for centuries, borders and boundaries everywhere you looked. Here, there were no boundaries, just grass and sky and the line of fence they followed, and that fence seemed less like a barrier than a thread connecting one part of infinity to another. "I could breathe here," Maria said at one point, stopping to rest. "Does that sound strange?" Greta understood. "No, I feel it too." When Crawford returned at 4 o'clock, driving slowly along the fence line to check their progress, he found them sitting in the shade of the truck, drinking water, and looking quietly satisfied with themselves. They'd flagged 37 spots needing repair, a thorough job that would save him days of work rechecking the entire line himself. "You did good work," he said, nodding at the flags visible along the fence. "Real good work. Next Sunday, if you want, we'll check the north pasture. Different terrain out there, more cedar breaks, couple of creek crossings, pretty country." They came back, the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and soon the routine established itself. Every Sunday morning, the ranchers would arrive at Camp Swift in their trucks, and the prisoner volunteers would pile into the truck beds for the drive out to whichever ranch needed work that week. Sometimes it was fence checking. Other times it was helping move cattle from one pasture to another, or cleaning water tanks, or the dozens of small tasks that kept a ranch running. The ranchers treated them like hired help, which meant treating them like human beings. They provided lunch, usually eaten sitting in the shade of trucks or under trees with everyone together, prisoners and Americans, sharing sandwiches and trading stories in broken English and gestures. They offered water constantly, knowing the heat could kill someone who wasn't careful, and they paid attention to small things, like making sure the truck beds had hay bales for comfort, or bringing extra hats for prisoners who didn't have good sun protection. And slowly, almost without anyone noticing, something began to change. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction: horses. Jack Morrison of the WWII raised quarter horses alongside cattle, breeding them for ranch work and occasional sale to other spreads. He had about 30 head at any given time, and on a Sunday in late April, he brought 5 of the gentler mares to a corral near where the prisoner group was working on fence repairs. "Any of you ladies know how to ride?" he called out. The women stopped working, looking at the horses with expressions that ranged from curiosity to fear. Most had grown up in cities, Hamburg, Berlin, Munich, where horses existed mainly as transportation for the rich or as military draft animals during the war. The idea of riding one for pleasure seemed foreign. But one woman, a younger prisoner named Anna Klein, stepped forward. "I rode as a child. My uncle had a farm." Morrison nodded. "Want to try again? This mare here," he gestured to a palomino with a blaze of white on her forehead, "is gentle as a kitten. Name's Daisy. Been teaching kids to ride for years." Anna approached the horse slowly, extending her hand for Daisy to sniff. The mare whuffed softly, nuzzling Anna's palm. Morrison brought out a saddle, showed Anna how to check the girth, helped her mount. Then he led them around the corral at a walk, talking constantly about keeping heels down, hands steady, weight centered. After 10 minutes, he stepped back and let Anna try on her own. She walked Daisy around the corral, then urged her into a slow trot. The other prisoners stopped working entirely, watching as their fellow prisoner moved around the enclosure, sitting the horse with gradually increasing confidence. Anna's face, usually reserved and careful, broke into something that looked like joy. "You're a natural," Morrison called out. "Your uncle taught you well." By the end of the afternoon, 3 more women had tried riding, all of them on Daisy under Morrison's patient instruction. And on the drive back to camp that evening, the women talked about horses and riding with an enthusiasm that Lieutenant Brennan noticed immediately when they returned. "Good day?" she asked Greta at evening formation. "We rode horses," Greta said, and the wonder in her voice was unmistakable. "They let us ride their horses." The word spread through the camp. The following Sunday, when the ranchers arrived, Almost 20 women volunteered for ranch work, double the usual number. Morrison and the others had to turn people away, promising they'd expand the program if they could get approval for more workers. Something fundamental had shifted. The prisoners were no longer just enduring captivity. They were beginning to experience something that resembled freedom, or at least a kind of freedom they hadn't known existed. The freedom of open spaces, of working with animals, of being trusted with tools and responsibilities that went beyond prison routine. And the ranchers noticed it too. "They work harder than most hands I've hired," Crawford told his wife one evening. "And they're grateful for things most Americans take for granted. Gave one of them a spare pair of work gloves last week, and she thanked me like I'd given her gold." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Tom, do you think about what they've been through to end up here?" "I do. They're just people, caught up in something bigger than themselves." "I know." "Then maybe we should treat them like people, not just workers." Crawford understood what his wife was suggesting, that the line between prisoner and person was thinner than official policy acknowledged, and that continuing to treat the German women as merely labor units was missing something important. The next Sunday, Margaret came with him to the ranch. She brought fresh-baked cookies, lemonade in glass bottles, and when lunch break came, she sat with the German women under the shade trees and asked them about their lives before the war. It started carefully. The women were hesitant, unsure if talking about Germany was allowed or even safe. But Margaret had a gift for drawing people out, and soon they were sharing stories about families and hometowns, about favorite foods and childhood memories, about the small, ordinary details of life that war had interrupted. Greta talked about working as a nurse in Hamburg, about the hospital where she'd trained and the patients she'd cared for before the bombing started. Maria described her job as a Wehrmacht telephonist, routing calls and messages, trying to make sense of a war that seemed to have no sense to it. Anna talked about her uncle's farm, about summer days spent riding horses through fields that stretched to forests where her grandfather had hunted deer. And Margaret listened, just listened, without judgment or propaganda, letting these women be human again. Other ranchers' wives began coming too. They brought food, asked questions, learned names and faces. They treated the German prisoners the way they'd treat neighbors who'd fallen on hard times, with practical help and genuine interest. By May, the Sunday ranch work had transformed into something that looked less like a prison labor program and more like a cultural exchange program that happened to involve fence mending. Washington noticed. A report crossed the desk of Colonel Raymond Parker, War Department liaison for prisoner affairs, noting unusual patterns at Camp Swift. Prisoner morale was described as exceptionally high. Local integration was proceeding at rates that exceeded normal expectations, and perhaps most notably, there had been 0 escape attempts from the women's compound, despite several opportunities during ranch work assignments. Parker called Lieutenant Brennan. "I'm reading your monthly reports," he said without preamble. "They're unusual, sir. Your prisoners are working on civilian ranches unsupervised. They're interacting with local populations. And according to your notes, some of them have received gifts from ranchers' families. Is that accurate?" Brennan chose her words carefully. "The Geneva Convention allows prisoner labor, sir, and it doesn't prohibit ordinary human courtesy. Human courtesy doesn't include gifts, Lieutenant. With respect, sir, we're talking about work gloves and spare hats. Practical items for ranch work, not contraband." Parker was quiet for a moment. "The concern, Lieutenant, is fraternization. We're at war with Germany. These prisoners need to remain prisoners, not become part of the local community. They're prisoners, sir. They return to the compound every evening. They're counted and accounted for. But while they're working, treating them like human beings seems to be good for morale on both sides. Morale isn't the issue. Security is. I'm sending an inspector to review your program." The call ended. Brennan sat in her office, staring at the phone, knowing that what she'd built at Camp Swift was about to face its first real test. The inspector arrived 2 weeks later, a captain named Harold Simmons, who looked like he'd never smiled in his life and saw regulations as holy writ. He spent 3 days reviewing files, interviewing guards, and observing the prisoner compound from every angle. On Sunday, he insisted on accompanying the ranch work detail. Brennan assigned him to ride with Morrison, figuring that if anyone could show the program at its best, it would be Jack. They drove out to the Double M with 6 prisoners in the truck bed, Simmons sitting stiff in the passenger seat, taking notes on everything. At the ranch, Morrison explained the day's work, moving a small herd of cattle from the east pasture to the west, about 2 miles across relatively open ground. Simple work, but it required coordination and some skill with horses. "You're putting prisoners on horses?" Simmons asked. "Been doing it for weeks," Morrison said. "They're good riders, better than some Americans I've hired." "And if they decide to ride away?" Morrison looked at him like he'd said something profoundly stupid. "Captain, we're in the middle of 70,000 acres of ranch land. They don't know the terrain. They don't know where the nearest town is. And even if they found it, they're German prisoners in Texas. Where exactly would they go?" Simmons didn't have an answer to that. He watched as Morrison saddled horses for the prisoners, showing the same care and instruction he'd shown since the program started. He watched as Greta and Anna and the others mounted up, moving with confidence that spoke of practice and comfort. And he watched as they spent the next 3 hours helping move cattle across open prairie, working alongside Morrison's regular hands with a coordination that looked practiced and natural. At lunch, Morrison's wife brought out food and sat with the group, prisoners and Americans together, sharing sandwiches and talking about the weather, the cattle, the endless small topics that made up ranch life. Simmons ate apart, taking notes. On the drive back to camp, he was quiet. Brennan met them at the gate, and Simmons spent an hour in her office reviewing what he'd seen. "This isn't standard procedure," he finally said. "No, sir, it's not. The regulations don't explicitly allow this kind of integration. They don't prohibit it either." Simmons looked at her for a long moment. "You understand what you're doing here, Lieutenant? You're not just running a prisoner program. You're conducting a social experiment. I'm treating prisoners according to the Geneva Convention and allowing them to work in ways that benefit both them and the local economy. You're making them American." Brennan let that sit for a moment. "Would that be so terrible, sir?" Simmons didn't answer directly. Instead, he closed his notebook and stood to leave. "I'll file my report. The program can continue for now, but with additional oversight. Weekly reports on prisoner activities, quarterly reviews, and any incidents, no matter how minor, must be reported immediately." After he left, Brennan sat in her office and let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The program would continue, for now. But she understood what Simmons had really said, that Washington was watching, and that the line between acceptable prisoner treatment and making them American was thinner than anyone had officially acknowledged. Jack Morrison fell in love on a Thursday in early June. It happened while teaching Anna Klein how to rope a fence post, a basic ranch skill, swinging a lasso to catch a target at 20 feet. She kept missing, laughing at herself. And in that laugh, Morrison heard something that made him look at her differently. She was 23. He was 36. She was a prisoner. He was her supervisor. Every regulation and social norm said this was impossible. He taught her to rope anyway. Over the following weeks, Morrison found excuses to work near wherever Anna was assigned. If she was checking fence, he'd happen to be checking the same section. If she was helping in the barn, he'd need to reorganize tack right then. His regular hands noticed and said nothing, recognizing something they'd seen before in various forms. A good man caught by feelings he didn't know how to handle. Anna noticed too. She began to anticipate where Morrison would be, to position herself where their paths would cross naturally. They didn't speak about it, didn't acknowledge what was happening, but both of them felt it. The pull of attraction that ignored every practical obstacle between them. By July, Morrison knew he had a problem. Not just an attraction problem, but a moral one. Anna was a prisoner under his temporary supervision. Any relationship between them would be automatically suspect, potentially coercive, impossible to navigate without violating either regulations or basic human decency. He stopped coming to the ranch on Sundays when prisoners were working. Anna noticed his absence immediately. She asked the other hands where Morrison was, received vague answers, and understood what was happening. He was protecting them both, maintaining distance because getting closer was impossible. It lasted 3 weeks. Then Morrison showed up on a Sunday in late July, found Anna working alone at a water tank, and said the words he'd been holding back. "I can't stop thinking about you." Anna looked at him, wind catching her hair, sunlight making her squint. "I know. This is impossible. I know that too." They stood 3 feet apart, the space between them loaded with everything they couldn't say or do. Finally, Morrison turned and walked away, and Anna watched him go, feeling something crack inside her chest. But Morrison wasn't the only one. Thomas Crawford's oldest son, Robert, had come home on leave from the Navy in June. He was 29, a lieutenant on a destroyer in the Pacific, home for 2 weeks before shipping back out. And on his second day home, he'd accompanied his father to the ranch during prisoner work hours and met a woman named Maria Vogel. They'd talked for maybe 10 minutes, about the ranch, about the war, about nothing important. But something in that conversation stuck with Robert Crawford, and when he returned to his ship, he found himself writing letters, not to Maria directly, that would violate regulations, but to his father, asking about the German prisoners, about how they were doing, about that one woman who'd worked as a telephonist. Thomas Crawford, who wasn't stupid and knew his son, mentioned the letters to Maria one Sunday. "My boy wrote about you." Maria looked up, startled. "What?" "My son Robert. He's in the Navy. Asked after you in his last letter." Maria didn't know what to say to that. She'd thought about the young naval officer too, about his easy smile and the way he'd treated her like a person rather than a prisoner. But he was in the Pacific, probably getting shot at by Japanese planes, and she was a German prisoner in Texas. The idea that he'd thought about her afterward seemed like fantasy. But the letters kept coming. Thomas showed her one in August. Just a paragraph, but the intent was clear. Robert Crawford was interested in Maria Vogel, and distance and circumstances couldn't stop him from making that interest known. By September, similar stories were emerging across multiple ranches. A cowhand named Billy Carter had started courting Greta Hoffman with a determination that ignored every practical obstacle. William Hart, the younger rancher with the broken arrow spread, had fallen hard for a prisoner named Lisa Werner, and was trying to figure out how to navigate that reality. Throughout the prisoner work program, connections were forming that went beyond the professional, beyond the acceptable, and people noticed. The first proposal came in late September. Jack Morrison appeared at Camp Swift on a Tuesday afternoon, not Sunday, and asked to speak to Lieutenant Brennan. She found him standing in her office, hat in his hands, looking like a man about to jump off a cliff. "I want to marry one of the prisoners," he said without preamble. Brennan had been expecting this, not the timing, not necessarily Morrison specifically, but she'd seen it coming. "Anna Klein." "Yes, ma'am." "She's a prisoner of war, Mr. Morrison." "I know that. Germany is still technically at war with the United States, even with the European conflict over. Until there's a formal peace treaty, she remains enemy personnel." "I understand that too." Brennan leaned back in her chair. "Then you understand this is impossible." "No, ma'am. I understand it's complicated, but impossible is different. The war's over in Europe. Germany surrendered in May. These women aren't soldiers. They're civilians who got caught up in something bigger than themselves. And now they're here, working on ranches, living decent lives, and some of us have gotten to know them as people, real people. And I love her." The simplicity of that last statement cut through all the regulations and complications. Morrison loved Anna Klein, and he was asking permission to act on that love. Brennan was quiet for a long moment. "Even if I wanted to approve this, and I'm not saying I do, it would require approval from Washington, from the War Department, possibly from the State Department. The process could take months, and there's no guarantee they'd say yes." "Then start the process." "Mr. Morrison, Lieutenant, I'm 36 years old. I've been running my family's ranch since I was 23. I fought in the First War, saw friends die in French mud, came home and built something decent out of empty land. I know what matters and what doesn't. Anna Klein matters, and if there's a process, I'll follow it. I'll wait as long as it takes, but I'm asking you to start it." Brennan pulled out a form, began filling it in. "I'll submit the request, but you need to understand. The answer will probably be no." Morrison just nodded. "I'll take probably no over definitely never." The request went to Colonel Parker's office. He called Brennan 3 days later, his voice tight with something that might have been frustration, or anger, or both. "One proposal I could handle as an anomaly," he said, "but I just received 6 more from Camp Swift. 6, Lieutenant. What in God's name is happening down there?" "Ranchers are falling in love with prisoners, sir. That's not supposed to happen. People don't consult regulations when deciding who to love." Parker was quiet. Then, "This is going to create problems. Political problems, social problems, problems I can't even predict yet. But I'll forward the requests. God help us all." Within 2 weeks, 37 formal marriage proposals had been filed with the War Department from ranchers, ranch hands, and local men who'd met German women prisoners through the Camp Swift work program. 37 men willing to marry enemy nationals, willing to navigate bureaucracy and social stigma, willing to bet their futures on women they'd known for less than a year. Washington had no protocol for this. The second inspector arrived in October, but this one didn't come alone. Captain Simmons returned, accompanied by 2 FBI agents, a State Department official, and a representative from the Judge Advocate General's office. They descended on Camp Swift like an occupying force, setting up in unused barracks and requesting every file, every report, every piece of documentation related to the prisoner work program. Lieutenant Brennan spent 3 days being interviewed. They asked about her decision-making process, about her supervision of the ranch work program, about whether she'd observed any inappropriate relationships developing and failed to report them. The questions were professional but pointed, searching for negligence or misconduct. "Did you know Jack Morrison was forming a romantic attachment to Anna Klein?" the JAG representative asked. "I suspected." "And you didn't intervene?" They weren't violating any regulations. The prisoners returned to the compound every evening. They're never alone together. Their interaction occurs during work hours, in public settings, under general supervision. "But you knew it was happening." Brennan met his eyes. "I knew human beings were behaving like human beings. I didn't think that required intervention." They interviewed the ranchers next, Morrison, Crawford, Hart, and a dozen others, asking pointed questions about their relationships with prisoners, about whether promises had been made, whether favors had been exchanged, whether anything inappropriate had occurred. To a man, the ranchers denied any impropriety. They'd fallen in love, they said, in the same way people had fallen in love since time began. Gradually, unexpectedly, inevitably. The fact that the women were prisoners complicated things legally, but it didn't change the fundamental truth of what they felt. The FBI agents were most interested in potential security breaches. Had the prisoners passed information? Had they attempted to recruit sympathizers? Had they shown any signs of continued loyalty to the Nazi regime? The answers were uniformly negative. The German women had integrated into ranch life with enthusiasm that seemed genuine. They worked hard, expressed gratitude for decent treatment, and showed no interest in sabotage or espionage. If anything, they seemed eager to distance themselves from the ideology that had led to war. One agent interviewed Greta Hoffmann for 2 hours, pressing her about her time in the Wehrmacht medical service, about what she'd seen and believed during the war. Greta answered honestly, describing the propaganda she'd been fed, the gradual realization that Germany was losing, the relief she'd felt upon capture, because it meant the war was over for her. "Do you still believe in National Socialism?" the agent asked. Greta looked at him like he'd asked if she believed in ghosts. "I believed what I was told to believe, and I did what I was told to do because that's what you do when your country's at war and you're young and scared. But I've spent 6 months in Texas working alongside Americans, being treated like a human being by people who could have treated me like an enemy. I don't know what I believe anymore, except that the propaganda was lies. And the Americans I've met are decent people, and I want to stay here if they'll let me." The agent made notes and moved on to the next interview. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. The team conducted over 200 interviews, reviewed thousands of pages of documentation, and inspected every aspect of the Camp Swift prisoner program. They found administrative irregularities, procedures that had been bent if not broken, rules that had been interpreted liberally, oversight that had been less than rigorous. But they found no evidence of actual misconduct, no coercion, no exploitation, no security breaches. Just a group of ranchers who'd fallen in love with prisoners, and a prisoner program that had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations at rehabilitating enemy nationals. The final report landed on Colonel Parker's desk in early November. He read it twice, then called Lieutenant Brennan. "Your program is being cited as a model for prisoner rehabilitation," he said, his tone suggesting he wasn't sure whether to be impressed or horrified. "The investigators found that your prisoners show lower recidivism to extremist ideology than any comparable group. They're more cooperative, more integrated, more American." "Is that a problem, sir?" "It's unprecedented. The question now is what to do about the marriage proposals." Brennan waited. "The State Department is developing a policy. It'll take time, probably months, but preliminary indication is that they're inclined to approve marriages on a case-by-case basis, provided certain conditions are met." "What conditions?" "Background checks on both parties, waiting periods, proof of genuine relationship rather than coercion or convenience, and the marriages can't take place until after formal peace treaties are signed with Germany, probably sometime in 1946. Brennan felt something loosen in her chest. So it's possible. It's possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. You can tell your ranchers that if they're patient, and if their relationships are genuine, Washington won't stand in their way. The news spread through the ranching community like wildfire. Washington wouldn't automatically block the marriages, but the couples would have to wait, possibly for more than a year, while bureaucracy processed their cases. For some, the wait was too much. 3 of the proposed matches dissolved under the weight of uncertainty, the men deciding they couldn't commit to such a complicated future, the women understanding and stepping back without bitterness. But the others held on. Jack Morrison continued coming to the ranch on Sundays, working alongside Anna Klein, never touching her beyond what work required, never speaking about the future they both hoped for. They existed in a strange limbo, committed but unable to formalize that commitment, together but separated by regulations and wire fences and international treaties that hadn't been signed yet. Thomas Crawford's son Robert wrote letters. They came weekly from the Pacific, passed through military censors who probably wondered why a naval officer was writing to a German prisoner, addressed to his father, but clearly meant for Maria to read. Thomas dutifully shared them with Maria on Sundays, watching her face as she read words meant to bridge the distance between Texas and wherever Robert's destroyer was currently sailing. By December, the ranch work program had evolved into something that looked almost normal. The prisoners had been at Camp Swift for 10 months now, long enough that the local community had stopped thinking of them as enemies and started treating them as familiar faces. They attended church services in town under guard supervision. They shopped in stores that extended them credit. They'd become, despite every regulation to the contrary, part of the fabric of local life. Christmas arrived with unusual cold, temperatures dropping into the 20s, and frost coating the prairie grass. The ranchers organized a Christmas celebration at Camp Swift, bringing food and decorations, setting up a tree in the mess hall, creating something that felt almost like home for women who were thousands of miles from their actual homes. Margaret Crawford brought a roasted turkey. Morrison's mother contributed pies. Other ranchers' families brought tamales, cornbread, sweet potatoes, all the traditional Texas Christmas foods. They set up tables in the mess hall and invited the prisoners to join them, not as prisoners and civilians, but as a community sharing a holiday. Lieutenant Brennan watched from the doorway, seeing what her program had created. The German women sat alongside American families, sharing food and stories, singing carols in English and German. Children from the ranches played with prisoners who'd become surrogate aunts. Old men told war stories that somehow bridged the gap between former enemies. And in one corner, Jack Morrison sat next to Anna Klein, close enough that their shoulders touched, talking quietly about nothing important, just existing in each other's presence, waiting for the bureaucracy to catch up to their hearts. Greta found Brennan later that evening. "Lieutenant, I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For treating us like human beings, for not letting us stay enemies." Brennan nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. "You did the hard part. You chose to trust us. We had no choice. You were our captors. You had the choice to stay angry, to hold on to ideology, to refuse to see us as anything but enemies. You chose differently." Greta was quiet for a moment. "In Germany near the end, we heard terrible things about American prison camps. That prisoners were starved, beaten, worked to death. My unit was captured in France, and I remember being so scared that I couldn't breathe. Then we got on trains, and they fed us. Real food, not rations. And I realized the propaganda had been lies." "Not all of it was lies," Brennan said quietly. "There have been camps where prisoners were treated badly. Just not here." "Why not here?" Brennan considered the question. "Because the people here decided to be decent. That's all. They didn't have to be, but they chose to be, and it made all the difference." The policy came through in March 1946. Formal approval for marriages between American citizens and German POWs, subject to background checks and a 6-month waiting period from the date of application. Jack Morrison and Anna Klein were the first to complete the process. They'd applied in September, endured months of investigation and paperwork, answered endless questions about their relationship and intentions. In April 1946, they received final approval. The wedding took place at Morrison's ranch on a Saturday afternoon. Not at the camp, not in a courthouse, but on the land where they'd fallen in love. Margaret Crawford and other ranchers' wives spent a week preparing, transforming the ranch house into something festive. Someone found a white dress that fit Anna with only minor alterations. Morrison wore his best suit, the one he'd bought before the war and rarely had occasion to wear. The ceremony was simple. A local minister presided, reading vows that sounded both ancient and new. Anna spoke hers in careful English, her accent thick but her meaning clear. Morrison's voice cracked when he said "I do," emotion overwhelming his attempt at composure. When the minister pronounced them married, Morrison kissed his wife, not his prisoner, not his employee, but his wife, and the assembled crowd erupted in applause that rolled across the prairie like thunder. Lieutenant Brennan attended in civilian clothes, wanting to be present but not wanting her uniform to remind anyone of the prisoner program that had made this possible. She stood in the back, watching as Anna Klein became Anna Morrison, watching as a German prisoner of war became an American rancher's wife, watching as the impossible became real. The reception lasted into evening. People danced to music from a borrowed phonograph. Food appeared in quantities that would have seemed obscene in wartime Germany: beef, chicken, vegetables, desserts. Anna moved through the crowd in her white dress, smiling and thanking people, looking overwhelmed by the reality that she was free, truly free, for the first time in years. Late in the evening, Morrison found Brennan. "I wanted to thank you, Lieutenant. You did all the hard work. No, ma'am, you created the circumstances that made this possible. You could have run that camp by the book, kept the prisoners locked down, never allowed the ranch program. Anna and I would never have met." Brennan nodded, accepting his gratitude. "Are you worried about what people will say?" Morrison glanced at his wife, who was dancing with Thomas Crawford's wife, Margaret, both women laughing at something. "People will say what they say. I know what matters. I've got a partner for building a life, someone who understands hard work and appreciates what we have here. The rest is just noise." Other marriages followed through the spring and summer. Maria Vogel became Maria Crawford when Robert returned from the Pacific in June. Greta Hoffman married Billy Carter in July. Lisa Werner married William Hart in August. One by one, the German prisoners at Camp Swift transitioned from captivity to citizenship, from enemies to family. Not all of them married. Some chose to return to Germany when repatriation began, wanting to search for family members or return to homes they'd left behind. Others remained in Texas as permanent residents, finding work in towns and cities, building new lives without marriages to anchor them. But for those who stayed, Texas became home in ways Germany never could be again. The war had uprooted them, captured them, brought them halfway around the world to a place they'd never heard of. And somehow, in this strange land of endless horizons and impossible distances, they'd found something that felt like freedom. By the end of 1946, Camp Swift's prisoner program had been studied by military officials from 3 countries. The success rate, measured in prisoner rehabilitation, community integration, and post-release stability, exceeded any comparable program. Fewer than 2% of the German women who passed through Camp Swift showed any continued sympathy for Nazi ideology. Nearly 60% chose to remain in the United States permanently. The secret, investigators concluded, was simple and profound. Treating prisoners like human beings produced better results than treating them like enemies. Lieutenant Brennan received a commendation for her administration of the program, along with a promotion to captain. She stayed at Camp Swift through its closure in 1947, overseeing the final prisoner repatriations and the camp's transition back to civilian use. Years later, she would be asked about the program in interviews and historical documentation. She always gave the same answer. "We didn't do anything revolutionary. We just remembered that prisoners were people, and people respond to decency." The ranchers who'd employed German prisoners found their operations strengthened by the experience. Some of the marriages they'd witnessed inspired them to hire more broadly, to look beyond traditional ranch hand demographics, to judge workers by capability rather than background. The German women who'd stayed brought skills and perspectives that enriched the community: medical knowledge, organizational ability, language skills that proved valuable as trade with Europe resumed. Anna Morrison became one of the most respected horse trainers in the region, building on the skills she'd learned during those first tentative rides at the WWII. She and Jack raised 3 children on the ranch, each of them growing up bilingual, comfortable in both American and German traditions. Maria Crawford returned to college after the war, eventually becoming a teacher in Austin. She specialized in German language instruction, helping American students understand the culture she'd left behind. Her children with Robert went on to successful careers, one becoming a diplomat specializing in European affairs. Greta Carter trained as a nurse practitioner and worked at the regional hospital until retirement. Her medical skills, honed in German hospitals and refined at Camp Swift, saved lives throughout her career. She never spoke much about the war, but her patients knew she'd come from Germany, and they trusted her with a depth that transcended national origins. The town of Taylor, near Camp Swift, eventually erected a small memorial to the prisoner program, not a monument to victory or conquest, but a simple plaque acknowledging an unusual chapter in local history, when enemies became neighbors, when war gave way to peace not through treaties, but through individual acts of decency. The plaque reads, "During World War II, German prisoners of war worked alongside Texas ranchers in this region. Many stayed, married, and became part of our community. Their story reminds us that humanity transcends conflict, and that treating former enemies with dignity creates lasting peace." The Camp Swift story became a footnote in World War II history, overshadowed by major battles and political decisions. But for the people involved, it represented something more significant than military victory. It demonstrated how quickly propaganda dissolves when exposed to actual human interaction. The German women had been taught that Americans were cruel, that capture meant suffering, that the enemy was fundamentally different and dangerous. One meal of eggs and bacon began undermining years of ideological conditioning. One Sunday of honest ranch work continued the process. 6 months of decent treatment completed it. The transformation wasn't about betraying Germany or embracing American superiority. It was simpler, recognizing that the people they'd been taught to fear were just people, complicated and flawed and decent, in ways that matched their own capacity for decency. The American ranchers learned something too. They'd been told Germans were fanatics, true believers in Nazi ideology who could never be trusted. Then they'd worked alongside German women, watched them struggle with English and laugh at their own mistakes, seen them cry when letters from home brought bad news, observed them work with determination and care. The ideology evaporated. What remained were individuals. Historians later noted that Camp Swift's success rate in deprogramming Nazi-indoctrinated prisoners exceeded any formal rehabilitation effort. No classes, no propaganda films, no structured intervention. Just ordinary life, shared work, and the cumulative weight of small kindnesses that made hatred impossible to sustain. The marriages were the visible symbol, but the real story was larger. Hundreds of German women passed through Camp Swift. Most didn't marry Americans, but nearly all of them left with fundamentally altered worldviews, their understanding of enemies and allies permanently reshaped by months of being treated like human beings.